On this edition of United in the Dark, witches, monsters, zombies, and more. We're talking horror sequels. What do you think of when you hear the words horror sequel? Sequels lack originality. Sequels rely on tired tropes. Sequels are simply rehashed old ideas. The sole purpose of a sequel is to recapitalize and earn a quick buck. Well, in regards to the majority of horror sequels, you probably aren't wrong. But there are some really wonderful examples of horror sequels done right, or at least that take an original, sometimes fun take on the genre. That's what I'm talking about today. I have 5 horror sequels worth checking out. I'll start things off with Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. The third film in the Halloween series, but the first and only to deviate from the ongoing story of crazed killer Michael Myers. Halloween 3 simply borrows the name of the franchise to help boost an entirely new story around the Halloween holiday. In fact, John Carpenter and Deborah Hill, who co-wrote the original Halloween and its immediate sequel, each wanted the franchise to take a horror anthology path forward, serializing each sequel as its own individual Halloween-themed story. Outside of this third film, that didn't happen, and Carpenter and Hill ended up producing Halloween 3 with Tommy Lee Wallace writing and directing. In many ways, the film is an homage to Don Siegel's 1956 film, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Halloween 3 deals with ancient and one could say corporate witchcraft revolving around the sinister and fictitious Silver Shamrock Novelties Company, known for producing latex Halloween masks. The masks in the film, which were created by the very real Post Studios, include a popular jack-o'-lantern, witch, and skeleton mask, each bright and wonderfully garish in their Halloween spirit. The plot is weird and steeped in suspicion, much like Invasion of the Body Snatchers was. But what has always made this film stand out to me is its daring attempt to be different, to inject some colorful, fun, and Halloween trickery into the story rather than simply falling into that cold-blooded killing and torture that's so prevalent in the genre. Sure, there are some plot holes, but the feeling of this film, the creeping dread and clearly grounded setting of Halloween, make it a great film for October. Now onto a true classic, not only of the genre, but of cinema history as a whole. My personal favorite of all the Universal horror films happens to be a sequel. In 1935, James Whale's Bride of Frankenstein, the first sequel to 1931's Frankenstein, boldly and brilliantly reshaped horror by introducing subtle wit and elements of comedy into the genre. The film features some of the most memorable and iconic imagery in the canon of great cinema, much of it based off of the skewed camera angles and jagged, shadowy sets of the German Expressionist movement from directors like Fritz Lang. In fact, James Whale's direct inspiration for the bride character was the artificial woman Maria from Fritz Lang's 1927 silent masterpiece, Metropolis. And while Whale referenced Lang, the practical movie magic and incomparable makeup effects of Jack Pierce throughout Bride of Frankenstein, including the bride's Nefertiti-like hair with a shock of white, have inspired countless filmmakers in the decades since. As with any of the Universal horror films, Bride of Frankenstein lacks any real terror when viewed from the dulled lens of today's horror audience. But that's part of what makes this film so timeless. This movie was produced at a time when it was scrutinized under the Hays Act, strict moral guidelines for the film industry. Yet, even with the film's screenplay censored during pre-production for depictions of Christian iconography and references to God, the film maintained its somewhat progressive bend by injecting camp and what some applaud as a queer sensibility to some of the film's characters and subtext. Historically, it's an important film, yes, but it's the farthest thing you'll find from a serious film. That fine line, that balance between terror and laughter, dark and light, is what makes Bride of Frankenstein one of the best, and is precisely why it's left its mark on the genre. Next up is George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, his 1978 sequel to his 1968 classic, Night of the Living Dead. Dawn of the Dead is perhaps the greatest example of the effectiveness of the zombie genre as social commentary. The film follows a group of survivors seeking refuge in a suburban shopping mall during a global zombie epidemic. Like many of Romero's films, the horror in Dawn of the Dead lies in the subtext. The setting of a shopping mall is an overt symbol for the false security of consumerism. Zombies flock to the mall, swarming around its doors, not because of a desire to eat the survivors holed up inside, but because of an ingrained, almost unconscious draw to the space. A mindless consumerism drives them. Likewise, the social order of the survivors in the mall begins to collapse throughout the film, as some rely on resource hoarding and gross materialism over practical survival and compassion.
They're after us. They know we're still in here.
They're after the place. They don't know why, they just remember. Remember that they want to be in here.
While Romero's horror is always played smart and executed thoughtfully, the makeup effects, gore, and action in Dawn of the Dead is equally effective. Tom Savini's makeup effects and Romero's zombie playbook set the standard for the zombie genre. You know, zombies are slow and moaning, various levels of decay, only a headshot can kill them. The Walking Dead would never exist without Romero. An interesting side note regarding Dawn of the Dead. Famed Italian horror director Dario Argento, an admirer of Romero's films, oversaw the European cut of Dawn of the Dead, released under the title Zombie. Interestingly, that cut would lead to its own Italian sequel, Zombie 2, directed by Lucio Fulci. You can't talk about horror sequels and not mention Fulci's film. It's another amazing example of sequels done right, and another of the greatest zombie films ever produced. I'll end today with two more horror sequels, both based on books. The first is 1990's The Exorcist III. William Peter Blatty, who wrote the original novel and screenplay for the first Exorcist, wrote a sequel novel called Legion that he would later adapt into a screenplay he'd direct as the third Exorcist film. The story is mostly separate from the original film and its immediate sequel. Despite some ham-fisted acting from George C. Scott, it's one of the more effectively unsettling possession films out there. It manages to creep under the skin with ominous and grand visuals and contains what might be the most effective jump scare of any film ever. The other sequel is 2019's Dr. Sleep, based off of Stephen King's novel of the same name. Dr. Sleep is a sequel to The Shining, my personal favorite horror film, and takes place 3 decades after that film, with Ewan McGregor playing a grown-up Danny Torrance. It's really an effective film, unsettling but not terribly scary. McGregor and actress Rebecca Ferguson are incredible throughout the film, and director Mike Flanagan did well adapting up until around the third act, which unfortunately suffers by relying too heavily on callbacks to Kubrick's original film. It's still a great film and a must-see for fans of The Shining. That's it for this edition of United in the Dark. I hope you have some time to enjoy some of these horror sequels this Halloween season.